people's background, but I'm pretty sure they talked to you enough and y'all had a chance to read it. So we can just jump right into it.
Well, you know, you're talking a little bit about art therapy and about art and creativity, and so, I mean, I think the gist here is that my late husband, Gene Cohen, he and I started this book together, and we started it many years ago, actually. He was the first acting director at the National Institute of Mental Health for the National Institute of Aging. So, and he was quite well known in his field from the perspective of, here he was at NIMH as a young, you know, young doctor during Vietnam years, and NIH has all of these institutes, right? Institute on Cancer, Institute on, you know, diabetes, and, you know, various things. And he was just sort of like, this doesn't make sense to me. Like, you should have an Institute of Aging. How can you understand what has gone wrong, you know, when an illness enters, if you don't understand what goes right, like just developmentally what happens? And at first they were kind of like, oh, you know, you're just a 30-year-old young doctor, blah, blah, blah. But then eventually they went for it. So, you know, he always used to say, you had to be careful what you ask for because it might come through. But my point is that how I felt like this was a segue is that he was diagnosed with a metastatic cancer in 1996. Like, seriously, serious diagnosis, like his PSA, he had prostate cancer. He never had prostate cancer, he had metastatic prostate cancer. So he went from normal to a PSA of 360. So the prognosis was not good. And he went on and was on hormone therapy, and after 10 years, he said to me, you know, I just think we should start writing. I mean, like, something we're doing is right. We're doing something that, you know, we should start writing. And I was like, there was a part of me even then that sort of felt like, oh, let's not change anything. Whatever we're doing, let's not change anything. But he was like, well, look, we're both educators, and he was a psychiatrist, I'm an art therapist. So we started writing, and so the reason I'm telling you this is that this book really started in 2005 under a different title, and he later passed away in 2009. His cancer came back in 2009. And that's the only time that he went through chemotherapy and that route. And then when he passed away, needless to say, I put the book down. And then a couple years later, well, all along, actually, I don't always start here, but I'm going to start at the end. I love to read from it, because if you spend 10 years writing a book, it seems worthwhile to read from it. But I'll just tell you this part at the epilogue. For years now, first as a quiet, intuitive voice, and over time as a louder, more forceful voice, I heard myself say, if you don't edit and publish this book, it will be as if Jean died twice. And I refuse to let that happen. Sometimes I don't like to start there because I think people are going to think I'm crazy, but the truth is that's exactly how it felt. It felt like I was holding on to a legacy, number one, of all of this work. Because it wasn't just that he was at the National Institute of Aging, it was that he was known as the person to shift the paradigm from looking at aging as a time of decline to aging as a time of potential. And not just in spite of aging, but because of aging. That actually our brains, our neurology, our immune systems, everything shifts. And he was very well known for that. So I had all of this unpublished work that is in here about that. Then the other part is that when we were thinking about, so just to finish that chronology, so he dies in 2009, somewhere around 2011, I begin to realize what I read, that, you know, he's going to die twice if I leave this in a box. You better stop crying and get yourself going. And so I'd take out the box and I'd sob, and I couldn't read anything, and then I'd fold it up, but at least it was out. And eventually I realized that Teresa Barker, who's on here with us, she was his editor of his other books. He wrote a book called The Creative Age and The Mature Mind. and she was his editor. So when I sent some sample chapters to Oxford, and then eventually got the contract, and that was somewhere between 2012 and 2013, I literally said, I can't teach somebody how to understand Gene and understand his science and make it through my grief. So I got to take her with me, you know. And that was a real gift because she knew him and she knew his writing and she knew me. So this book really, if you look at it, came out in March of 2016. So I guess I'm starting by saying to you, I can say now that I think it's a really hopeful creative story in the sense that, first of all, things take a long time. And secondly, even though they go through ups and downs and valleys and God knows what, it's amazing to complete it and to have it and to know that, you know, I wrote my way through my grief on top of everything else. The good news for me about being here is that I don't feel compelled to, you know, teach you what he said about aging, or I'm not in front of an art therapy group where I have to look for the stories, and it has that. There's a lot of different voices in here. There's kind of, he was a scientist, I'm an artist, we're both psychological. And when he died, there really were two voices, everything that he had written and everything that I had written. And we had worked together to kind of play with them. You know, after you say that, then I'll say this. And then, you know, to kind of have this conversation between these two voices. Then he died, and I was like, well, nobody's going to want to read this book that goes da-da-da-da-da-da-da, very much an outlier, and you get to chapter 11, and it goes, oh, by the way, he died. So I realized, okay, we have to change this all up. All the chronology has to go. And then, of course, in the process of having lived through illness in a family, and there's a chapter in the book called The Family Body, which is how I think of it, as it's the disease is in somebody's body, but the illness is in your family body, because it takes place in all the ways that you relate. It's in your heart, it's in everything that you do. So now I forget where I was going with that, but what I wanted to say is that the process of going through that and then looking backwards and being in my own grief, I realized, okay, he was very much an outlier for over 14 years. And that's a pretty amazing perspective. But now I'm in grief, and I really don't like these books that, you know, that make it seem like it's all better, or you move on, or, you know, I used to say to people, I would start reading some book on grief and then I'd swing it across the room. And when I started working on this, I said to Teresa, my aim is that we think about the reader at every single paragraph, so that even if they don't like the book, they do not throw it across the room, like, you know, because that's how I felt. Where, you know, and think about it, there really are books that take you into somebody else's chronology, so much so that there's no room for you. Or, you know, take you into a story and then at the end go, here are the 4 things that you learned from this story. I hate these kinds of things. I'm always feeling like that. So I worked very hard to try to be extremely aware of a pace and a rhythm of a reader going through a process. And I think about that even at a reading like this. It's this book, Sky Above Clouds, Finding Our Way Through Creativity, Aging, and Illness. It's an existential conversation. It's a conversation about what happens with things that we don't want to talk about that happen, like illness and aging and dying and grieving. So I'm going to read you just a tiny bit from the preface, because I've sort of said to myself I get to read things that I like. And one of the things that I wanted to say about that conversation is that at a biographical level, yes, it's a conversation between Gene and me, between husband and wife, between scientists and artists. It's a relationship. But the most important part of the conversation to me is that things that we write about activate something in you. meaning inner reader, that remind you of things that matter in your life, your own health, health of people that you love, losses that you've had. That's what I mean when I say throwing a book across the room, because I felt like I was reading and somebody wasn't paying any attention to what happens as a reader, which is that stories activate things in us, and we need to be taken care of if we're going to be activated in that way. So I say that to us here, that when we, we'll follow Ed's schedule, but when we get to have Q&A, I'm really interested in whatever comes up for you as I read certain things, that even if it's about your life. I often say to people, please don't think that if your mind went off to someone you care about and something that happened in that life, I don't want you to think that I thought you weren't paying attention to me. Because really what I think is that, I think of that as the mind-body loop. That I say something that goes into your unconscious, it touches something in you, it activates something and brings something up. So, from a vulnerable view place, I want to start with, it's actually in like chapter 13, but after Gene passed away, because of his role in a lot of organizations, I was asked to go around the country and receive awards for him in American Society of Aging and Gerontological Society. And so I did, and I wrote something and I read it. And I was thinking that when this was here, because one of them was at the American Society of Aging, and my friends were literally, they were like human crutches. That's what it felt like to me, like holding me and carrying me. And so my friend Michael, who's in your picture actually, it's just interesting that you chose it. Yeah, because he's here, right over here, on this side of me, Michael Patterson. He was a dear friend of Gene's and does a lot of work on the brain. And he said to me, just as I got up in front of everyone, he said, and whatever you do, do not look down at the videos. I said, okay. So I stood up, I read what it was that I had to say, and then, when somebody tells you not to do something, you kind of can't help it. And I looked down, and all along the front of this thing were huge screens with a huge portrait of Gene, at which point, of course, I instantly did exactly what he knew would happen to me. My legs started to fall, and he came up, and Gay came up, and, as we're walking away, he said, I told you not to look down. So anyway, I'm better now. But at the last one of these, I got up in the morning, and I had what I was writing, which was very much about Gene, and very much, it's a role, this is, he would be very proud, and this is, and then I had this other voice in me that was like, okay, this is for the Society for the Arts and Healthcare. It was an organization we both belonged to. I thought, this is a group of artists. If I can't say the truth to them, maybe I'm never going to be able to say the truth. And then very quickly, do you have this where, you're talking, you've got this like existential dilemma going. I hear this other voice going, Wendy, they're not interested in you. You're here in a role, just read what you're supposed to read. But you have to quiet that artist's voice. You can't just ignore it. So I wrote what I had to say, and when I got up in front of people, I decided to say it. And the reason I like to start my presentations with it is that I am now so surprised to think that I thought this was the boldest thing in the world, to get up and say this publicly. I look at it now and I'm like, really? So it goes like this. It's just 2 paragraphs. What is it that really heals when enormous craters have plummeted into your heart? What art form can return to us all that has been taken? How does creativity strengthen the broken? Grieving certainly feels broken. This is the truth of our experience. When everything slips away, the search is constant for what remains. Gene died surrounded by music. Songs by our friends filled our living room, where his weary body rested on the couch we called his nest. His friend of over 40 years, fellow father of geriatric psychiatry, arrived in time to serenade from our piano. His son camped out for weeks in a sleeping bag beside him on the living room floor, just as he had done as a young boy. Well into the late hours of his last evening light, our then 15-year-old daughter's piano reverie calmed him asleep. There's no beauty here, just truth. Creativity, healing, it's our only call, our heart song to the inexplicable, where the silence reverberates somewhere in our hearts. And I start there because I am shocked that if you think about it, death is an experience that is going to happen to all of us. And we're either going to experience it, we're going to lose someone we love, or someone we love is going to lose us. And yet it felt really bold to get up and actually say something about what it felt like to go through that process.
Wendy, could I ask you to please read it again?
Sure. Is that okay? That way we
Yes.
came in, so welcome.
Thank you.
What is it that really heals when enormous craters have plummeted into your heart? What art form can return to us all that has been broken? How does creativity strengthen the broken? Grieving certainly feels broken. That is the truth of our experience. When everything slips away, the search is constant for what remains. Gene died surrounded by music. Songs by our friends filled our living room where his weary body rested on the couch we called his nest. His friend of over 40 years, fellow father of geriatric psychiatry, arrived in time to serenade from our piano. His son camped out for weeks in a sleeping bag beside him on the living room floor, just as he had done as a young boy. Well into the late hours of his last evening light, our then 15-year-old daughter's piano reverie calmed him asleep. There's no beauty here, just truth. Creativity, healing, it's our only call, our heart song to the inexplicable, where the silence reverberates somewhere in our hearts. Now at the time, I thought the book was going to be called Heart Song. So that was part of it, really saying it is a heart song. And at the time that Gene died, he originally thought that the book was going to be called The Phoenix and the Fairy, and other stories of challenge and second half of life and psychological development, God knows what, some big, long whatever. But The Phoenix and the Fairy, which is where Sky Above Clouds ends, chapter 15 is called The Phoenix and the Fairy. And The Phoenix and the Fairy is a fairy tale. Well, I excerpt from it. It's a fairy tale that Gene wrote because when he first was diagnosed, our daughter was 18 months old. So he had this sense of like, uh-oh, what if she doesn't have a chance to know me and to know her father? So he wrote this, and then he lived, as I said to you, for another 14 years. And so the fairy tale became something that he added on to, and then I added on to. He was the phoenix, I was the fairy, and there was a certain point where I was like, if I'm going to be the fairy in this story, I don't like the voice that you're giving me. Like, let me write my own voice. And then she grew, and so he started reading it to her. So I'll just give you a tiny bit about that, because I think it's kind of interesting. I like to read from it. Originally, Gene started writing a fairy tale to Eliana, his young beloved toddler of a daughter, because he feared he wasn't going to live long enough for her to remember him. He became frightened at the thought of what could happen to him, and therefore what could happen to everyone he loved. But particularly because she was so young, he feared what she would have or not have to hold on to as love, guidance, and dad. We read her so many stories and fairy tales. She loved stories, as all children do, and the characters and images began to come alive and be part of our family life. 101 Dalmatians became the action dogs she loved, the party theme for her birthday, the cake, the dress code, the animal print pants, and the skirts that went all through elementary school with her. One night, she called out to her dad, frightened by a dream or by something that happened in her room. He He sat down on the edge of her bed to comfort her, and she cried into his chest, "Daddy, I don't want Cruella de Vil in my house. I don't like her." He held her in his arms, gently wiping away at her soft tears, trying to soothe her back into sleep. She couldn't really say what had upset her, but it didn't matter. She needed comfort, and he was there to give it to her. As he began to feel that she was resting back to sleep, he quietly started to leave the room. "Not even in a book, Daddy. I don't even want her in my house in a book." Her voice tiredly awakened. Jean promised her he'd take the storybook off, and he did. And as he left the room, his heart so deeply touched by her fragile innocence, he realized how many cruel things he wanted to remove from ever frightening her. He wanted to remove everything from her house that could ever frighten her or harm her. He didn't even want them in her heart. And yet he knew already that he would never be able to protect her from life itself. He wanted to remove anything and everything that could ever bring harm to his little love. He wanted her protected. He wanted her sturdy. Yet she was just a young child, naive and innocent, all ears awaiting the knowledge of her life to become her guide. Slowly over time, merging her needs with his needs, he began to write the tale, The Phoenix and the Fairy. He wanted to capture something about his own life journey in which he faced challenges and setbacks, dreams of heroes and ogres, which ultimately illuminated his own fears, his own creativity, and his own strengths. And that was really the beginning of the book. That's how it started. And then it grew, and we grew, and we got to live into being a family. And I actually end the book, and maybe I'll end today at that point, with what she thought at 21 years old when I was writing this. And I went back and I said to her, "Do you remember this fairy tale? And what do you remember? And what do you think Dad was trying to do?" So it's kind of interesting, the time that, I think that's the real miracle story in life, the time that we get to find out things about ourselves and about people we love. So I wanted to just also, I'd like to just contextualize, if that's okay, just give you a sense of this book. So I've told you that it's kind of an existential book, an existential meeting with myself. And also finishing this book is really a testament to that process of facing our creativity and working through things. When we bring forth our challenges, our opportunities, our next steps, we navigate and claim the creative edges of our thinking. That's the gist of this book. When we bring forth our challenges, our opportunities, and our next steps, we navigate and claim the creative edges of our thinking. That's really what potential means. And that's what Sky Above Clouds refers to in terms of our creativity. So I want to read you just a tiny bit from the preface, which maybe more linear people, and actually probably my late husband, he would have written the preface at the beginning, but I didn't write the preface was the last thing that I wrote. So this is my favorite part, and I think it gives you a sense of the book. Both Jean and I love to study psychological development and the creative arts. With his background in aging, he researched artists in the latter part of their lives. He was always in search of new ways to talk about aging, to translate more vividly the exciting emerging science and clinical stories of aging and insight into new metaphors and images that could represent a truer sense of the potential in our development as we creatively age into wisdom. He was frustrated, as we all should be, by the endless supply of stereotypical images that focus on decline in our older years. All you have to do is search for a birthday card for an older friend or a family member to see exactly what these images of aging convey. Even taken as efforts of humor, frankly, they're not very funny. The stereotypes, as Jean saw them, are damaging, if not immediately to the individual, then systemically to our culture, a culture that has historically portrayed and perceived older people in fairy tales as weird, wicked, or weak. And in real life, in a state of decay. It's the autumn of your life. The leaves are falling off your tree. It's the winter of your years when the ground is covered with snow. And he was committed to changing that image, both literally and metaphorically. One of our favorite artists was Georgia O'Keeffe, who, although she loved to travel, she didn't fly until late in her life. She actually was afraid of flying. But that new aerial perspective appears to have been especially significant as a visual experience for O'Keeffe because in her 70s, she painted her Cloud series. So I don't know if you've ever seen them, but they're huge. They're 96 by 108, and they're called Sky Above Clouds, and she did 7 of them. And Jean suggested that her Sky Above Clouds images were more apropos as the new metaphor for aging. So this book was written with the intention of bringing Sky Above Clouds, depicted by O'Keeffe, to life. That there will always be clouds. Thus, there will also always be sky above clouds. That space in which life's complexities have the chance to become clear, where we can make the quantum leap into our own potential and into our own vision. What we can know is that clear sky above, a something else, awaits us, an inner capacity for change and adaptation that is incontrovertible as nature itself. That something else I like to call the creative faculty. It's what draws us to life. It calls forth our love and the reality of what is possible for each of us. I chose to title the book Sky Above Clouds after he passed away. I chose to title it to honor him and his vision. I chose to honor O'Keeffe and hers, and to honor in each of us our own process of creative aging. So that's what the title means and what it's about. And I feel like it's probably around the time that you take a break, and I thought that would at least kind of give you a sense of where the book started, what it kind of went through. It went through this kind of tunnel, if you want, of the heart song, from Phoenix and the Fairy to the heart song, and ended up with Sky Above Clouds. Okay, go.
How did you and your husband meet? I'm just curious because you guys seem like polar opposites, I guess, because you're very, I would assume you're artsy and he's kind of analytical. With the title that you mentioned, how it sounded very like a book I would read at the university, which I like, but right. I'm just curious, like, how do you guys marry the two worlds, I guess?
Okay, so that means if you get this book, Ed, you should start with chapter 2, because chapter 2 is called Strategies, Tactics, and Counting, and it's about cribbage, and it's the story of how we met, which is, I mean, in a nutshell, we met by a mutual friend who both Jean and I went through divorces, and this mutual friend was close to his first wife, and when she met me, she said, "Oh, I have this friend and he's going through a divorce, and you both are going through it in similar ways. Would you like to meet him?" I was like, "Are you kidding me? I mean, if you've ever gone through something difficult," I'm like, "No, I don't want to meet some other person who's as miserable as me right now. No, not at all. No interest." You know. But then 2 years later, we overlapped at an event that her husband was a trombone player, and we overlapped there. And why I said you should read chapter 2 is that he patented the cribbage board. So cribbage is a game that's 350 years old, but he made a new cribbage board for older people, in which he used the peg. The peg is different on each side. It's a different color. I mean, his own father had Alzheimer's, and they had played cribbage when in his youth, and he saw with his dad that, God, this game needs some real serious helps for people who are blind or have memory problems or whatever. So I'm walking you through this because I never read that part because I'd probably sob through the whole part, so I just have to tell it to you. So we went to dinner. It was our second date. He had gotten this patent for cribbage, so he was just roaring to tell a story. And I didn't know him yet that much. I'd only met him once, and And I'd had this dream about cribbage. And I thought, well, I'm going out with a psychiatrist, I'll tell him the dream. So we had this thing of like, no, I have a story to tell you. No, I have a story to tell you. Well, you go first. No, you go first. And they both were about cribbage. And so somewhere in that, I have to tell you, somewhere in that meeting, it was dinner, I just started looking at him differently. And I started going, you know, because my dream, which I tell in the book, is all about a childhood friend of mine who had passed away, which was very difficult. I'd lost a dear friend, was when we were in college, but he'd been my friend in high school, he'd been my boyfriend. All of us were just devastated over this, and I had this dream after my divorce where he came to me and he said, if you want real love, play cribbage. So this is the dream, and Gene goes first. And his story is that he just got a patent, and I'm sitting there listening going, oh my God. He looks like a disheveled scientist, and I'm like, wow, oh my God. And so,
That's crazy.
chapter 2 is where you start.
That is crazy. Wow.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's more like a writing question about word choices. So one of the excerpts that you read from us, actually the one that Kim asked you to reread, I found quite poetic, and it was a lot about the way you were able to create a visual space for the readers and evoke that emotion. Like saying craters, and some of the use of the words, and that your son was sleeping in a sleeping bag, and that type of wordplay, and that you can see the environment that you're talking about, and it definitely evokes the emotion for the reader. So
Right.
I just wanted to ask you about, how did you construct that? How did you decide on the word choices?
That is such a great question, because I'm going to answer it really honestly. That is both my strength and my weakness. And why I say it like this, that I am sort of a rambling writer. I ramble I talk around things, I circle around things, I go here, I go there, and I'm also very visual. I'm a sculptor. So I'm very visual. So in becoming a writer, well, I've written my whole life, but I didn't call myself a writer till I did this book. But in becoming a writer, at first, I was worried about all that. Like when I started working with Teresa, I was like, oh my God, things would come back to me with 95 red marks. I just think, oh my God, I don't think there's one word in here that's okay. But she never took away my mythopoetic voice. She always recognized that I had a capacity to do what you're talking about. So in many ways, my development creatively as a writer has been to honor how I see things. And the word I use is mythopoetic. I mean, I'll tell you, here's my favorite paragraph in the book. And it was part of some long thing that got edited out. And if you're a writer, I mean, working with an editor is so important, but it's also so hard, because it depends on who an editor is, and they're very busy chopping away at you. They're always chopping away. And so an entire section I had written in this ramble was taken out. She was like, the reader doesn't need this. And I was like, oh my God. And I finally went through it and I realized, okay, this is the paragraph that it needs. And she said, okay, you're right. And that process of learning how to let go of all the rambling that I would often do but then find the part that had the rhythm, I think that's been my skill. So if it's okay, it's only 6 lines, so I'll just read it. It's my favorite paragraph for whatever reason. It's in chapter 4, which is called Crucible of Time. And for me, chapter 4 is where I began writing. It wasn't called chapter 4 then, but Gina and I were on a trip with the whole family, and I was busy sort of thinking about time. Like originally I wanted it to be called Finding Our Way Through Creativity, Aging, and Illness Time, because that was a concept to me, illness time. But the publisher and everybody, they're like, people don't know what illness time is. They think that you made a bad sentence or whatever, whereas actually it's very much what you're asking about. Illness time is a concept, but it's also a space. And if anybody who's ever gone through illness or lived with illness, you know it's real. Like, it doesn't move chronologically, things don't make sense, calendar time doesn't work anymore, you think that person can't die because it's a holiday. I mean, you're just like, all kinds of stuff gets really messed up about time. So illness time made a lot of sense to me. Anyway, here's my favorite paragraph. It's not that we transform time, rather time transforms us, and I'm not okay with that. I'm railing against the universe because as a pack rat, I thought that I'd be able to move through time with all my people, all my cells, and all my loved ones. I didn't yet know that we give up, give over, lose, trade in all the time. That what I call illness time is the time it takes to come to grips with all that comes your way. That health, illness, healing, the struggle, the whole of it, is what forms the self, and that we're all here for one purpose, and that's to help one through thick and thin, no matter what we feel about it. The rest, weather, and dreams.
Yeah, so
The rest, weather, and dreams. Let's hold at that for a second. Wow.
I mean, really, aren't there zillions of people who, they talk about the weather, whatever that might be. They just talk about the weather. And then you have people who talk about their dreams. So you have these outer world people who are very good with small talk and good with whatever, like, you know, like The Little Prince. Do you know that book?
Yes.
You know, and he talks about, well, so the grown-ups, you know, I guess we better talk about golf. That's weather to me. And then you have dreams. But really, we're not here for either of those purposes. We're basically here to help one another, no matter what we think, and no matter what we feel, and whether we like it or not. I mean, that's just what we do. But
I flashed on the shooting
uh-huh.
as you read that.
Really?
I live only a few blocks from here. Unfortunately, I wasn't here the day of the shooting of it, but I drove in last night and the field was lit and the cop cars, I mean, it was like midnight last night.
Right.
The field was lit and the police cars had still blocked the road.
Right.
And, you know, I can hear the people talking about it, like the weather,
Right.
and those of us who speak about it as a dream,
Exactly.
to call for something positive in our society.
Right.
So your words go deep in all kinds of contexts. I really
Yeah.
appreciate them.
I think because I'm a sculptor, I think about construction. Like I'm not sure, you know, I always have a voice in me that says, well, like a real writer would do it differently, or, you know what I mean? I don't know who a real writer is or a real sculptor. We always have this image, somebody else does it differently or something. But I just appreciate that you noticed that, because that's a really big thing for me, that the book has a rhythm. And it's not an easy book. I mean, it's dense. There's a lot of stuff in here. It was very clear to me in the course of writing it. Like, some people might be like, oh, well, write this and then, you know, for my next book. But I was like, you better say everything you've got to say, because this might be your opus, because this is really hard. And it's taken over 10 years. So, like, you know, put it all in here.